The locals in Black Hollow don't call them feral people. They don't call them anything at all. They just stop looking for you after the sun dips below the ridgeline. I found out why during my first week as a park ranger. Welcome back to Whispers After Dark, where the shadows speak and the night listens. I'm your host, and tonight we begin a new journey into the deep, unsettling quiet of the Appalachian Mountains. These are scary stories to sleep by. That is, if you can. You see, I never truly believed the folklore until I found a stack of unfiled missing person reports hidden under the floorboards of the Black Hollow Ranger Station. Reports dating back to the 1970s, all with the same words scribbled in the margins: taken. I guess I should introduce myself. My name is Cole Jackson, and I'm a park ranger in a place called Black Hollow Campground, buried deep in the back country of the Appalachians. It is one of those word-of-mouth places, because you won't find it on any map that I know of. If I had known what I know now about what lives in these mountains, I would have thought twice about taking this job. They say these mountains are old, so old that they've forgotten the names of the things that first walked them. But do you believe a forest can have a memory? Do you believe a stretch of woods can develop a taste for the people who wander too deep into its shadows? I didn't until I came to work here. I found that Black Hollow has a way of getting what it needs. What it needed was a park ranger. What I needed was a fresh start. A former detective until an undercover case went bad, and I ended up sidelined with a bullet in my gut. I retired early and rattled around my apartment thinking how I needed to get out of the city and get back to my roots. That's when the letter came about this job. I never questioned how it got in my mailbox. I just packed up the few things I wanted to keep and hit the road. Now, here I am in a backwoods campground office that looked like it has seen better decades, sitting on the office floor trying to move a rusty old desk that weighs a ton. The air in the office was stagnant, tasting of dust and old, sun-baked paper. My hands were slick with sweat as I gripped the edge of the desk. When it finally groaned away from the wall, the sound was like a scream in the quiet station. That's when I saw it. A single thin folder, wedged in the dark gap like it had been hidden on purpose. My fingers brushed the rough cardstock, sweeping away a thick skin of dust before I pried it open. The first page was brittle and yellowed with age, but a name and a date seemed to pulse under my touch. June 1974. I needed a break, and now was as good a time as any. I grabbed a Coke and half a leftover sub sandwich from the fridge from the small kitchenette in the room next to the office. It was small, but the bed was comfortable. It was almost twilight, and the breeze was cool and clean compared to the stagnant dust of the office. So I wandered outside to the small picnic table. I opened the file and thumbed through them as I ate. Each one dated with the same handwriting. Each one had the same thing written in red along the edge. Taken. I picked up the one that had first caught my attention. As I opened the yellowed pages, the station beside me seemed to bleed into the trees. I wasn't at the table anymore. I was standing in the damp, midnight chill of a 1974 campground. I could smell the sharp, dying embers of a bonfire and hear the distant, frantic pulse of a truck radio. And then the heavy, suffocating silence that followed when the engine stopped. I wondered if I was the first person to see this in 30 years. The air around me suddenly turned to ice, and something heavy shifted in the underbrush. In that moment, I realized the forest didn't just have a memory, it had eyes. I turned the next page carefully, the brittle paper whispering against my thumb like it didn't want to be disturbed. The report itself was short, typed unevenly on old county stationery with handwritten notes filling the margins. Back then, Black Hollow wasn't much of a campground at all. Just a rough clearing carved into the trees, a handful of fire rings, a warped wooden sign, and a gravel pull-off where locals came more than tourists. Most of the people who spent the night out there did it in tents or the beds of trucks. According to the file, it was mostly local kids who used the place after dark. Bonfires, beer coolers, loud radios, the kind of place where laughter carried through the trees until the cops showed up to shut it down. The report was dated 1974. Her name was Tammy Peterson, 18 years old, brown hair, blue eyes, cashier at Miller's Grocery over in town. The picture stapled to the corner was a school photo, a little faded from age. Feathered hair, bright smile, the kind of face that looked like it belonged in a yearbook under Most Friendly or Best Smile. The report said her parents told deputies Tammy had called home after work that evening and said she was going to meet some friends at the old campground for a party. She told them she wouldn't stay long. Her mother had asked her not to be late. Tammy laughed and said she'd be home before midnight. That was the last time they ever heard her voice. The report said she left work driving her parents' station wagon, an old country Squire with fake wood paneling down the sides. I could see it bouncing down a narrow mountain road, windows down, radio up, with the headlights cutting tunnels through the dark. There were no streetlights out this way then. Hell, there still aren't many now. Once the sun dropped behind the ridgeline, those roads turned black as shut eyes. The file said her friends waited at the campground, but Tammy never showed. They figured at first she'd changed her mind. It wasn't until her parents called around and nobody had seen her that worry began to harden into something worse. I could feel the shape of that night as I read. The uneasy phone calls, the father getting in his truck, the mother standing on the porch in her house shoes, staring at the road as if headlights might still come rolling up the drive. By morning, the family had reported Tammy missing at the ranger station. There wasn't much of an organized search to speak of in Black Hollow back then. No polished rescue teams, no helicopters circling overhead, just locals. Men in work boots and canvas jackets, hunters with rifles slung over their shoulders, a few hounds straining at their leads, all of them gathering in that gray hour after sunrise when the mountains still held the cold like water in a stone basin. There were notes from previous months clipped behind the main report, small complaints collected in no particular order. Missing food, coolers dragged off in the night, a tackle box gone from beside a tent. One man claimed he woke to find muddy handprints on the side of his camper. Another said he saw somebody crouched low in the brush watching his family eat supper, but when he grabbed a flashlight, there was nothing there except branches still shivering like something had just slipped through them. Most of the reports were dismissed. Animals, teenagers, drunks, pranksters. That was the tone of the writing anyway. No real evidence of foul play. But as I kept reading, I started to notice how often the same words came up. Watched. Movement in the trees. Strange footprints. Something on two legs. Nobody wanted to write down what they really thought, but the fear had stained the paper all the same. One of the handwritten witness statements attached to Tammy's case came from a male teen that had been at the campground that night. He claimed he saw somebody in the woods watching them while they drank around the fire. Said every time the flames dipped low, he caught the shape of something pale between the trees. Another girl said she heard rocks clicking together out in the dark and thought it was kids messing with them until she shined her light into the woods and saw two eyes low to the ground, too far apart and too steady to belong to any deer she'd ever seen. By midnight, the party had broken up. By sunrise, Tammy Peterson was missing. The next pages described the search. A pair of hunters helping with the sweep found the wagon first, nearly a mile off the main road, down an overgrown sidetrack that ended in a dead patch of gravel and scrub. The assumption at the time was simple enough. She took a wrong turn in the dark, tried to turn around, blew a tire. But when they got closer, the scene told a different story. There were skid marks cut black into the dirt, not long, but sharp, as if she'd hit the brakes hard and fast. The driver's side door was hanging open. One headlight had been broken. The front fender was scraped. Her purse was on the seat. The keys were gone. There were smears on the side of the car that one deputy first wrote off as mud until somebody touched it and found it tacky. A bloody handprint smeared along the hood. I felt my grip tighten on the page. The men searching the area found prints in the soft dirt near the skid marks. The report called them unusual barefoot impressions, possibly deformed human tracks, but that was too neat a phrase for what had actually been described in the margin by one of the hunters. Looked like people tracks if people had claws, toes long, nails dug deep, several sets, different sizes. The kind of note a man writes only when he doesn't know how else to say what he saw. 2, maybe 3 sets circled the car. There were signs of a struggle in the weeds beside the road. Broken brush, a piece of torn fabric caught on a branch. Long drag marks pressed into the earth, leading away from the wagon and into the trees. As I read on, the station around me seemed to go silent in a way that didn't feel natural. Even the breeze outside had died. I could almost hear those men pushing through the undergrowth with their rifles in sweaty hands, the dogs whining low in their throats, noses working the scent. The report said they followed the trail nearly a quarter-mile into the woods. Broken limbs showed the way, ferns crushed flat. Mud churned where something had been dragged downhill toward a creek bed, choked with moss-slick stones. About halfway there, they found one of Tammy's shoes, a white sandal with the strap torn loose, lying on its side in the leaves, as if it had simply slipped off her foot and been left behind. One of the dogs refused to go any farther after that. Another kept pulling toward the trees instead of the creek, barking at nothing anybody else could see. The hunters wrote that they felt watched. Not once. Repeatedly. One man claimed he heard breathing behind him when nobody was there. Another said he caught movement pacing them through the bushy undergrowth, always just beyond the reach of sight. By then the day was draining out of the mountains. Shadows filled the hollows early in that part of the world, and men who would walk fearless into the woods for a bear or a wounded buck began glancing over their shoulders. Uncertain. Watchful. They followed the drag marks as far as the creek, but the water swallowed what little trail remained. On the opposite bank there were broken branches and one gouge in the mud that might have been another print, but the light was failing and the dogs were coming unraveled. The searchers turned back before full dark. I paused there and looked up from the page without meaning to. The trees beyond the ranger station windows had gone a deeper shade of blue-gray, and for just a second I had the sick, crawling feeling that if I looked too long, I'd see a face low among them. Not human exactly. Human enough. I forced my eyes back down and kept reading. The official search continued for days, then weeks. Men combed ridges. Volunteers checked creek beds, hunting shacks, old wells, and abandoned homesteads half swallowed by the hills. Tammy's parents kept pushing, kept begging, kept calling. The file had thin little updates tucked every few years into the folder, like dried leaves. No remains located. No new witnesses. Family requests renewed search. Area canvassed again with negative results. The wording became colder as the years passed, but I could feel the ache underneath it. Somebody had kept adding to the file long after everybody else had decided nothing was coming back out of those woods. And then, on the final page, there was one last handwritten notation in red ink, smaller than the others, sharper. Like whoever wrote it didn't want it noticed unless somebody was truly paying attention. See File 1277B. That was all. No explanation, no signature, just that. And as I stared at those numbers, the ice that had crawled into my spine settled there for good, because I knew, without knowing how, that Tammy Peterson had not been the beginning. She had only been the first one somebody finally bothered to write down. I gathered the papers slowly, more carefully than I meant to, as if the brittle pages might come apart in my hands if I moved too fast. The last light of evening had thinned to that strange blue-gray hush that settles over the mountains just before full dark, and sometime while I'd been reading, the campground around me had gone still. Not quiet exactly. Black Hollow never really felt quiet. There was always some small sound under the silence, the dry rattle of leaves, the creak of old wood cooling, the far-off complaint of something moving through brush where no trail ran. But the sounds had changed. The birds had gone. The air had cooled enough to raise a fine prickling along my arms, and above the trees the moon was beginning to work its way up over the ridgeline, pale and thin and watchful. I folded the file shut and carried the remains of my supper inside. The half sandwich had turned soggy in its wrapper, and the Coke had long since gone flat. I dumped the trash, rinsed my hands in the little sink, then stepped back outside just long enough to make sure the station door was clear and the cans were shut. I don't know why I stood there that extra second. Maybe I was listening. Maybe I was trying to convince myself I wasn't. The gravel lot looked washed in silver under the rising moon, the tree line beyond it dark as a wall. I had the sharp, unwelcome feeling that if I stared too long, I'd see somebody standing there where the shadows thickened between the trunks. Not moving, just waiting to be noticed. I went back inside and locked the door faster than I wanted to admit. I put the file in the top drawer of the bedside table beside my bed in the station's back room, then took a shower in the cramped bathroom off the kitchenette. Dust and sweat ran off me and swirled toward the drain, but it did nothing for the feeling that had settled beneath my skin. 15 minutes later I climbed into bed. The lamp beside me cast a low amber circle over the rumpled quilt and wood-paneled wall. I lay back and shut my eyes, telling myself I was tired enough to sleep. I wasn't. My body was still, but my mind wouldn't settle. The same words kept rising over and over in the dark. One shoe in the leaves, strange tracks in the dirt, the red notation at the bottom of the page. See file 1277B. Every time I started to drift, I'd see that line again, sharp and neat in the yellowed margin. I rolled onto one side, then the other. The bed creaked under me. Outside, something tapped once against the station wall. Just a branch, probably, or maybe an acorn falling from an overhanging limb, but it made my eyes snap open anyway. The room felt too small. The silence felt crowded. I sat up and reached for the lamp. The light clicked on with a flat little snap, pushing the dark back just far enough to make the corners of the room seem deeper. I punched the pillow behind me, leaned against the headboard, and pulled open the top drawer. I pulled out the file and thumbed through the pages, past Tammy's report, past the clipped updates, until I found the notation and the next referenced file tucked behind it. File 1277B. The paper there was newer than Tammy's had been, but only just. Still yellowed. Still carrying that faint smell of age and dust and old ink. The typing was more confident, the pages thicker, but the handwriting in the margins was the same. Same hard slant to the letters. Same cramped notes pushed into whatever white space had been left. Whoever had written Tammy's file had written this one too. I felt that strange little tightening in my chest that comes when a pattern starts to show itself, whether you want it to or not. As I opened the report, I could feel the years shifting under me again. Tammy had vanished in 1974. This one was dated July 18, 1985, and scrawled beside the date in the same red handwriting was the same single word written in Tammy's file. Taken. It was high summer. More than 10 years later. The top page identified it as a missing persons report, then a secondary search file, then an incident supplement. 4 people. The Calloway family, father, mother, 2 children, a boy, 10 years old, and a girl aged 6. I read the first paragraph twice. According to the report, the family had left home for a week-long camping trip somewhere off the Blue Ridge route. after mentioning to the grandparents that they'd seen an old sign for a place called Black Hollow Campground while traveling through the Appalachians the previous season. They wanted somewhere quiet, off-grid, secluded, just trees, stars, and a creek for the kids to play in. The father had apparently joked over the phone that they were going to disappear from the world for a few days and fish, cook over a fire, and let the children run wild. When they failed to check in after the expected return date, the grandparents waited one night, then made the call. I could picture that too clearly. An older woman gripping a phone cord in a kitchen gone cold around her. A man in suspenders standing beside the table, looking out the window every few minutes as if the truck might still come rolling back into the driveway. The report said the family had last been heard from 8 days earlier. No known mechanical issues, no known conflicts, no indication they planned to go anywhere else. Unlike Tammy's case, this one had drawn more attention. The file said the grandparents had gone first to the county office, and by then enough time had passed and enough worry had built that a more formal search was authorized. Not much by modern standards, but more than what Black Hollow had seen a decade earlier. A few state men, a couple of local deputies, search volunteers, dogs. One television station out of the nearest town ran a short segment about a family overdue from a mountain camping trip, and for a brief stretch it became the kind of story people shook their heads over at gas stations and diner counters before moving on with their day. The search team located the Callaways' campsite before noon on the first day. There was a rough diagram of it in the folder, hand-drawn and labeled in the margin. 2 tents had been pitched in a clearing near the old campground edge, not far from a stand of hemlocks and the shallow creek that cut down toward the lower hollow. The truck was still there when they arrived, parked crooked in the weeds with plenty of fuel in the tank. The engine turned over when tested. Their supper had been left half-finished. Table and chairs overturned, a cooler had been torn open. Paper plates were scattered. Remnants of hot dogs and beans had been dragged through the dirt. The campfire in the ring had gone cold sometime in the night. There were notes in the margins about the tents, not collapsed by weather, torn. One of them ripped down one side as if something had caught the canvas and peeled it back, not slashed cleanly with a knife. Torn, jagged, and uneven. One sleeping bag was still inside, half out of the tent flap and coated in dirt. A child's sneaker had been found near the fire ring. Another was under the picnic table. Then came the detail that made me lower the file for a second and stare at the wall. A Polaroid photograph had been found face up in the grass near the truck. The report described it as partially developed and dirt-stained, likely dropped during or immediately after use. Someone on the search team had slipped the actual photo into a paper evidence sleeve, and it was still there in the file. I eased it out carefully. The image had gone soft with age, the colors washed to weak browns and faded green, but the scene was still clear enough. A family campsite in late evening. Table, cooler, lantern glow. One of the children half turned toward the camera. In the background, between the trees at the outer edge of the clearing, stood a figure. Even through the chemical blur and age damage it was visible. Tall, thick through the shoulders, hair or matted fur catching the pale flash in uneven patches. Not close enough to make out a face, but near enough that there should have been one. Instead, there was only the suggestion of a head tilted too slightly, too deliberately, as if it knew it was being photographed. Looming was the word typed in the notes, and for once the official language had gotten close. The figure wasn't just there. It seemed to be leaning into the moment, intruding on it, claiming it. I slipped the Polaroid back into its sleeve and kept reading. Searchers found what were believed to be the children's prints, leaving the campsite at a run toward the western tree line. Small sneakers, uneven stride, one set overlapping the other, as if the children had been stumbling over each other in the dark. The mother's tracks led in a different direction, angling toward the creek, barefoot after the first few yards. Then they stopped, just stopped. No return tracks, no sign she'd fallen, no drag marks from that point. One line of prints in soft soil, ending in open ground, as if the earth had swallowed her where she stood. Then a mention of odd human-like clawed prints with a notation that said possible bear. But I had seen a description like this last night, written in Tammy's file. The father's tracks were stranger still. The report said they never clearly left the campsite. His boots had churned the dirt between the truck, the fire ring, and the torn tent. There were signs of a struggle near the picnic table, and deep impressions behind the truck, where somebody had braced hard, heels dug in. One of the deputies noted there were drag marks leading away from the rear of the camp into the brush, broad and disturbed, and hard to read once they hit the roots and rocks beneath the trees. Blood was not immediately visible, though later notes suggested trace evidence may have been present on torn canvas and the truck bed. Whatever happened, there had been violent, but fast. The search expanded outward in widening circles. Dogs picked up conflicting scents and kept breaking off toward the deeper timber. Several handlers complained that the animals were agitated in ways they didn't normally see. One hound planted its feet and refused to enter a patch of brush less than 200 yards from the camp. Another broke into a fit of snarling, so sudden it had to be restrained. The report mentioned sounds heard at dusk by volunteers on the second day. Whistles in the trees, a cry that resembled a child calling for help, then cutting off abruptly, branches snapping where nobody could be seen. Most of that had been pushed into the handwritten notes instead of the official report body, which told me all I needed to know. They had heard things. They just hadn't wanted those things typed into the record. The search went on for nearly a week. I could feel the exhaustion in the pages by then. Ground covered, ravines checked, creek banks walked. No sign, no remains, no clothing except for one child's sock caught under a root. The television interest died quickly after the first few days. The deputies pulled back. Volunteers got fewer. By the end, it was just locals again, and whatever ranger had kept writing these notes long after everyone else had given up. Then came the entry dated 6 days after the family had first been reported overdue. 2 local hunters of the remaining search party. The ink had faded enough that I had to squint to make the names. Were working an area roughly a quarter-mile northeast of the campground when one of the dogs caught scent near an old chestnut tree. The tree itself was described as dead but still standing, split low on one side and scarred with age. Carved into the trunk at chest height was a large eye. I paused there and read that line again. Below it, the margin note expanded on the description in the same hard slanted hand. Rough folk carving, old, deep cuts weathered gray, scratches beneath not matching natural bark damage. I could see it before I ever got to the next paragraph. That dead tree standing in dim mountain light, bark silvered with age, and that crude eye staring out from its trunk as if the woods themselves had marked it. Not decoration, not whimsy, a sign, a warning, or maybe a claim. The dog kept worrying at the base of the tree, whining, pawing through leaves and damp soil. The searchers scraped back debris with shovels in their hands. Only a few inches down, they struck bone. The report turned clinical there, and that somehow made it worse. Partial human remains recovered in shallow burial, skull intact, torso present, upper and lower extremities absent, advanced decomposition, sex undetermined at scene, personal effects minimal. I swallowed and kept reading. The ranger's margin notes told the truth the typed report would not. Buried careless, like scraps. No arms, no legs, ribcage marked, not cut clean. There had been something else with the remains. Something caught beneath the collapsed side of the ribcage and worked into the dirt underneath. a ring of car keys fused with soil and corrosion. One key had a chipped blue plastic cover on the head. Another was longer and older, likely for the rear wagon gate. Attached to the ring was a faded float charm shaped like a red fish. I felt the bottom of my stomach drop, because there, clipped to the inside of Tammy Peterson's file, had been a brief property note from 1974. Vehicle recovered, purse recovered, keys not located. But the description of the keys had been noted down to the red fish. I read the paragraph after that twice. Remains tentatively linked to prior missing person case pending family verification and property match. Probable identification, Tammy Peterson. The ranger had underlined that line in red years later. The words DNA verified, body, Tammy Peterson were written in the margin. For a long moment I just sat there with the file open in my lap and the lamp burning low beside me. The room had gone very still around me. I could hear the faint tick of cooling pipes in the wall, and somewhere beyond the station, the long, lonely rasp of insects outside in the summer dark. My hands had gone cold. Tammy hadn't been taken cleanly into the mountain and vanished forever. Part of her had come back, not found in some ravine by chance, not washed up in a creek bed after a flood, buried, deliberately, hidden beneath a tree marked with that carved eye, only to be uncovered 10 years later because another family disappeared in the same patch of woods. I turned the page, already knowing there would be more, and hating the fact that the detective in me needed to see it. I kept reading until I came to a folded sheet clipped to the back of the report. The paper was softer from handling, the creases worn nearly white. When I opened it, I found a hand-drawn map done in pencil, rough but careful, the kind made by men who knew the woods better than they knew paperwork. There were no clean survey lines, no polished legend, just a winding road, the old campground marked with an X, the creek bend, a dead stand of timber, and farther in, a second mark circled hard enough to tear the page. Beside it, in the same handwriting as the notes, someone had written, "Tree where remains were found. Directions given by original hunters. Use lower trail. Watch the creek crossing after rain." At the bottom, a crudely sketched drawing of an eye. I stared at that map for a long time. I could almost see those two local hunters standing over a table somewhere 10 years earlier, hats in their hands, rough fingers tapping the page as they tried to explain where they had found her. Not because they ever wanted to go back, but because they knew somebody would have to. I folded the map shut more slowly than I had opened it. The lamp beside the bed cast a weak yellow light over the page. Beyond the curtained window, the moon had climbed higher, casting a pale shadow on the floor. For a moment I just sat there with the file in my lap, listening to the old building settle around me. A board creaked. Pipes ticked softly in the wall. Somewhere outside, something called once from deep in the trees and then went quiet. I closed the folder and set it on the blanket over my legs, but I already knew I wasn't done with it. The map had changed that. Tammy Peterson was no longer just a name in a brittle file or a ghost pressed between yellowed pages. She had become a place, a marked tree in the woods, a shallow grave under old leaves, a spot in Black Hollow that still existed, still waited, whether anyone wanted to see it or not. Over the next 2 days, the story stayed with me like a splinter under the skin. It followed me while I swept out the station, while I checked the trail's nearest camp, while I stood on the porch in the early morning with a cup of coffee gone cold in my hand, staring into the tree line and thinking about that carved eye. Every path through Black Hollow started to feel different after that. Older, hiding something. I found myself looking past the campground and toward the deeper woods, toward that place on the map where the hunters had marked the tree. By the second evening, I had stopped pretending I was going to leave it alone. Before I opened the next file, before I let myself fall any deeper into whatever thread tied Tammy Peterson to the Calloway family and the word taken scrawled in red across all of it, I needed to see where she had been found. I needed to stand there for myself. Maybe it was the detective in me that never quite died. Maybe it was plain stupidity. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the answer to what happened next didn't start in the file. It started in the woods. And whether I liked it or not, Black Hollow was waiting for me to come looking. By the time I went to bed, my mind was made up. I would find the tree. Call it morbid curiosity, or call it closure. I made it only a short way down the trail the next morning before instinct stopped me cold. The morning air was cool and damp, carrying the green smell of wet leaves and creek water. But all at once the woods felt too close, too watchful. I stood there with that hand-drawn map in one hand and the trail stretching ahead of me into the trees, and I knew better. I had spent too many years walking into bad situations to go blundering into one unarmed just because I was wearing a ranger's badge instead of a detective's shield. I turned around and headed back to the station, my boots grinding softly over gravel. Inside, I went straight for the lockbox and pulled out my sidearm. The weight of it settled into my hand with a familiarity that ran deeper than comfort. Old habits, old instincts, maybe old ghosts too. I holstered it, checked it once, then stepped back outside and pulled the door shut behind me. The trailhead started not far from the station, just a narrow break in the brush that was easy to miss if you didn't know where to look. I followed it with the folded map in one hand until about a quarter-mile in, the path split just like the old drawing said it would. I took the narrower branch and pushed on through thick undergrowth where the trail had nearly disappeared beneath briars, roots, and years of neglect. The farther I went, the stranger it felt. The air was cool and damp, heavy with the smell of earth and leaf rot, but there were no sounds, no birds, no insects, no rustle of anything moving through the brush, just dead silence. The kind that makes you feel like the woods are holding their breath. Then I saw it. The tree stood ahead of me, old and gray, its bark split with age. Carved into the trunk at chest height was the eye, weathered but still there. I pulled out my phone and took a couple of pictures, my gaze never staying on the screen for long. Something about that place made it hard to stop looking over my shoulder. That was when I noticed another marked tree off to the right. The carving there looked newer, the cuts sharper. My eyes were locked on that carved eye, its jagged edges looking like a wound in the bark. Then my boot caught on something soft, not moss, fabric. I crouched down and pulled it free from the tangle of roots. It was a little girl's sweater, pale yellow, tight-knit, handmade. Even caked with dirt and stained by years in the ground, I could still see the little embroidered flower near the hem. And the second I touched it, I remembered the description in the file. The grandmother had told them about it when the family was reported missing. She had made it herself. Holding that tiny sweater in the dead silence of the trees, I understood that whatever had happened in Black Hollow had not ended with Tammy Peterson. I had an uncanny feeling that whatever it was that killed her had continued, and there were other stories of the same inside the taken file. I stayed at the base of that tree for a long time, the yellow sweater clutched in my hand, staring at that carved eye until the shadows began to stretch and crawl across the forest floor. In the distance, I could hear a distinct clicking sound that made my skin crawl. I didn't just feel watched anymore. I felt hunted. My hand went to my gun as I slowly turned, scanning the trees and the thick brush around me. Then I heard it, a sharp clicking sound, maybe 70 yards out. A few seconds later, another answered it from farther off to my left, no more than 50 yards. Then a third came from somewhere ahead of me, closer now, 30 yards, maybe less. I fired one shot into the air, and the crack of it tore through the hollow. After that, everything went dead quiet. I backed toward the trail, keeping my eyes on the trees, and once I reached it, I wasted no time getting out of there. I made it back to the station as the sun set. I hurried inside and locked the door. Not that a wooden door and a bolt of steel felt like much protection against whatever was out there. I sealed the sweater in a bag, sat down at the desk, and pulled the folder back in front of me. My hand rested on the next file for a long moment. If Black Hollow was going to give up its secrets, they were buried somewhere in the taken files, and I had a feeling the next one was waiting for me. What do you think is hiding in Black Hollow? Something human or something older? If you've heard the feral people legends of Appalachia, tell me in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next dive into the taken files. Until next week, stay curious, stay cautious, and beware of the whispers after dark.